They have replaced their stethoscopes for placards. The junior doctors go on strike on Friday for 5 days, demanding a whopping increase in pay. Are they fighting for their rights, or is this just naked greed?
We speak to leading IVF doctor, Lord Professor Robert Winston, who thinks that those who are going on strike are forgetting their patients.
Strikes in this situation are unethical because patients will suffer. It's very likely if this lasts at all long, somebody will die. Several people clearly are going to have much worse chances of getting their cancer treated, and some people will be less well or in pain or have serious problems with their families.
Doctors, Tim, they've become 2025's miners. They're going on strike again for 5 days tomorrow because they've been given a 22% pay uplift, but they actually want 29% on top.
And when that 22% was agreed, the government treated it as an example of the maturity and calm of Labour, that if you treat public sector workers like they are servants and rational people you can deal with, then all this problem will go away. Well, no, because they've come back on top of that with a demand for 29%. It's proof that you can feed the lions, but you can never satisfy the lions. Wes Streeting has said he is not going to negotiate on pay, but he's willing to negotiate on conditions. And we should point out that the British Medical Association says that wages are still around 20% lower in real terms than they were in 2008.
Yes, but then the BMA keeps on being repeatedly challenged on its figures because it's come out with this claim that they are 23% down on pay according to inflation. But then the Institute for Fiscal Studies has said that's not quite right because you're using the wrong kind of index. And also, whenever you're discussing your pay, you're never discussing your pension. And your pension is extremely generous, as they always are with doctors, enabling you to retire early because you have put in a shift in your professional life. This is controversial because I do believe in the right to freedom of expression and protest. I'm wondering whether doctors should actually be exempt from striking because of the potential fatal effect that it can have on patients.
Yeah, and there were 5 deaths that have been linked to the disruption caused by the last junior doctors' strike. So there's an argument for that. And only 1 in 4 of British adults, when polled by Ipsos in July, support resident doctors going on strike, and 2 in 4 are opposed. And that opinion is also shared by some experts in the field. Our colleague Gordon Rayner earlier spoke to Professor Lord Robert Winston, who is a leading IVF doctor, who in July resigned from the Doctors' Union, the BMA, over the strikes.
So, Professor Lord Winston, thank you for making your debut on the Daily Tea. Could you just explain to our audience why you've decided to resign from the BMA after 60-odd years?
Yeah, it's a good question. It was a difficult decision in one sense because I thought it might be public, although it wasn't my intention. But I did then, having thought about it, I did write a letter to the Times, and I think the Times were going to publish the letter, and then they thought they would do an interview instead. I feel that the BMA does not represent a very large proportion of the medical profession. I think that is the key issue. I also think that it is acting highly politically at the moment. It seems almost deliberately an attempt to challenge a government which is struggling with a very difficult situation for the whole nation, not just the health service, but really trying to do a lot of things at once, some of which are not being done perhaps as well as they should be. But nonetheless, they're certainly trying to do it honestly and honourably. And I think, above all, the thing that was really critical was that the junior doctors, I have to call them resident doctors now, though I don't quite know what the difference really is, because they're mostly not resident, they're mostly living at home, actually. But the resident doctors, who have to live in, of course, whilst they're on call, I think they'd already received a settlement just months before, and then having received the settlement under the previous government, having called a strike very close to a general election, then did this. And it seemed to me that many of them must have been pressurized. I can't believe they wanted to do this, but anyhow, they have done. And I felt that this was a highly immoral thing to do at the present time, at this time when people are all struggling with all walks of life, in all professions, and particularly with the difficult financial situations we have.
So you think that the 20 odd percent pay increase they're demanding on top of the they had 22% last year or over 2 years, then another 5.4%. Now they want another 20 odd percent. You just think that's unreasonable in the current circumstances?
Well, I think it's unreasonable to try and, if you like, blackmail a government having already received a pretty generous award. Maybe it's not what they actually wanted, but it was they had agreed to it, and I think that's pretty dishonourable. But more importantly, I don't think doctors should strike. I think there are certain services, there are certain professions where, in fact, you should avoid withdrawing your work at all possible costs. And obviously that would apply to the fire services, the police, the armed services, a number of people in the civil service and so on. And I feel that doctors have a huge moral obligation. And it seems to me that there are a number of things that we would want to discuss about that. But I would question, really, we've always been under pressure in the health service. Obviously when I was a junior doctor, I got an absolutely trivial pay, but frankly, for the first time I was doing a job, I was actually prepared to have done it for nothing, because actually it was such an interesting job and was so worthwhile for patients who are quite clearly desperate. And I think above all, what has happened here is that the doctors who are striking have forgotten one of the most important things. They are sitting in front of somebody who they don't know very well, but who is actually opening up themselves in a very private way, in a way that they don't particularly want to do so. They're often in pain, they're often very worried, they often think they've got something much worse than they really have got. They're about to be subjected to all sorts of humiliating tests and investigations. They're in hospital away from their family. They're worried about money, they're worried about their family. And the doctor has a unique privilege. Nobody else in the world has that privilege that you have as a doctor. And I want to say that to them, because actually, if you abuse that privilege, you do run great risks, actually, about the relationship you then have with the patient afterwards. And I fear to say that I think it's very, very obvious that my colleagues, the resident doctors, have lost the plot. I think actually they've also, more importantly, probably lost the trust of the nation. And I think it's going to be very difficult to get that back.
Yes, so that's an important point. I was going to ask you just how damaging this is for the NHS's relationship with the British public, which has always historically been very good. It seems to have deteriorated quite a lot in recent years. How much more is it going to deteriorate, do you think, as a result of this?
Well, of course, they're right to recognise that, and I think they do recognise that. And of course, that is a great problem. And I think in fact, that what we should really be doing is discussing possibly a new way of funding the NHS. And I think that, in fact, this sort of thing really prevents any chance of having constructive discussion about what we might do to make sure the NHS is really fit for the purpose for which it was built. But we do have to remind ourselves that we're dealing with an operation which is ancient. I mean, Ira Bevan brought this in the 40s. And of course, the capitation fee per patient, the cost per patient in the nation, was about 10 and sixpence, 55p. It's now roughly £3,000 per every patient in the NHS. And it's not free at the point of delivery, of course, it is part of our taxation. Nonetheless, we do pay for it. And therefore, we have a need to find out how that money is being spent. And this, of course, is a colossal wastage of that money.
You said that maybe we need a new funding model. What might that look like?
Well, I think it's a really difficult question to answer just on the hoof. But I actually think that we have this mantra about a free NHS, which is just simply not really true. It's not free. The question really is, how are we going to pay for it? But it is a big industry. It's a massive industry. And in fact, we don't even know how much the industry actually costs. For example, if you're the managing director of a large factory producing goods, and we're much bigger than that, you would have to know actually how much your goods cost, how much they could be spent on them, how you manufacture them, and you'd know every stage of the cost of the proceedings. We don't know any of that in the NHS. So we don't know, for example, how it is that, for example, let's say a telescope inspection of the gut in Worcester would be a different cost from, let's say, in Wales or Scotland or, in fact, South England, because there's a tariff, and it depends, of course, on an internal market, which, of course, is quite flawed. And that was introduced a long time ago, and I think it was always a bad idea. I think both parties, in fact, adopted it. I think both actually in some degrees of reluctance.
Okay, just to go back to the matter at hand, these strikes that are coming up. You mentioned the BMA, and you mentioned that you thought the BMA had become politicized. Obviously, the chairman of the BMA is a chap called Thomas Dolphin. We know that he ran as a Labour candidate in the election, and that he is a fan of Jeremy Corbyn. Thomas Dolphin says that the BMA is a non-partisan organisation. Is he telling the truth?
I've no idea. What I do know is that when I resigned, it got massive coverage. I mean, I know there were about 700 letters on the column of the Times after my interview, and I asked if I could talk to either the president or indeed the chair of the council or one of his representatives. There's been complete silence. So I don't know whether that is a political thing or not, but it seems to me to be rather foolish that we can't even talk about it, given that, I am admittedly largely non-political, but I am, at least in the House of Lords, able to perhaps to help in some ways to weather this storm in any way I can with the kind of appropriate publicity, without understanding why they've done what they've done. It's difficult. But, one of the issues, for example, that the BMA has to consider, the BMA has, amongst other things, a role as looking at ethics. It has an ethics committee that has some national significance. So it looks at ethical issues which affect medicine. But how can that ethical committee have any respect any longer, when it's just done something which is clearly unethical? That's a big problem, because strikes in this situation are unethical, because patients will suffer. It's very likely, if this lasts at all long, somebody will die. Several people clearly are going to have much worse chances of getting their cancer treated, and some people will be less well or in pain or have serious problems with their families.
So you're very clear there. You think that people will die as a result of these strikes?
Well, inevitably they will. You can't avoid it. I mean, you can't simply allow disruption of services to this scale not to accept the fact that, more accidents will happen. I'm not saying they're going to be deliberately killed. Of course they're not. But there's a real risk to patients in actually withdrawing your labour.
That said, should doctors be banned by law from striking?
No, I don't think people should be banned ever from striking, but I think we have to ask ourselves, are we actually appointing the right people as doctors? For every single one of the striking resident doctors today, there will be at least 6 or 7 applicants to each medical school around the country, all wanting to do medicine, all who, when they applied, would have had the same qualifications and the same A-levels and the same skills. But in fact, they've been privileged to be chosen, because in fact, in a long time, they have one of the few professions which really does good to people, which is really thanked by people, and which is for life. And it's a rewarding profession. If I was doing medicine again, I would certainly want to be a doctor.
How would you screen out, though, people who were, activists or people who might be strikers? How would you do that?
I don't know. But I think we need to know why actually whether this is just inherent in medical schools. I don't think it is. But I do think that different medical interviews are different in each school. And perhaps maybe we have to find better ways of understanding what doctors want. But on the other hand, I think when you apply to do medicine, you have to understand what you're applying into. When I talk to medical students, which I do very frequently, prospective medical schools, I make it very clear that the NHS is not an easy place to work in. I say, look, this is difficult, but in the long term, it's still worth doing. And I think what's happened now is that there is such dissatisfaction. I don't say that governments aren't to blame, indeed, as well. Of course they are. I mean, successive governments have not handled the NHS well because we've not been truthful about what we do.
Do universities play a role in this? Then you're a professor, you lecture, don't you? Is there a role for universities in explaining to medical students the responsibilities they have, and perhaps just sort of trying to, I don't know, depoliticize the whole profession from its roots?
I think that's a very interesting question. I think, truthfully, that whatever you do at university, school doesn't prepare you for the course you do at university. What you do at university doesn't prepare you for a job either. In fact, when I first got on the wards, I made a terrible mistake on the first day, almost killed a patient with injecting something which was in fact quite dangerous. I was very lucky. We got away with it. Therefore, I didn't get suspended. In fact, I couldn't find any seniors at the time because they were all doing other things. That's the problem, of course. And so I gave this drug thinking I was doing the right thing, waiting for them to return a call. But in the course of those days, there were no bleeps, which made it a bit more difficult. So I don't apologize for doing that. It was unfortunate. It turned out well. The patient survived. She left hospital perfectly well. But I think the issue really is that whatever you do, particularly in this very complex profession, nothing really prepares you for it. However, you do need to understand, I think, how you actually relate to other people. And maybe that's a real problem here. I think in many professions, particularly medicine, emotional intelligence is often much more important than intellectual ability.
Okay.
It's a form of intellectual ability, of course it is, but it is different. And I think that maybe that's something we should be thinking about. And people obviously write in an OCA form, the sort of what they've done, their job experience and all the rest of it. Most of this stuff really is a waste of time. It sounds good, but it's not actually what we really need to know about what people really aspire to and what they really want to do and how they would handle things which are difficult. And I think, for example, if you were a soldier at Sandhurst, you would spend all sorts of times doing very difficult things in horrible conditions before you went into the college. And you start to understand actually the real aspect, not the glamour, but the other side of what you would be doing in your training. It's a very good training. Even so that at one point at Imperial College where I work, we even considered sending students to Sandhurst to see how we could actually improve the training of our students generally, not just medical students, but there was one particular area of the college where we thought we might be able to do better if we actually mimicked some of the things they did at Sandhurst, quite irrelevant to the actual course.
Interesting.
We didn't do it, I don't think. Rather pity, but it was an interesting idea.
You're a Labour peer. Presumably, you know Wes Streeting. What should he be doing at the moment? Two things. Should he have made reform of the NHS a prerequisite for the pay rises that the government has already agreed to? And what should he be doing now to try and stop these strikes happening? Should he be trying to do something on conditions, perhaps, or I don't know? You tell me.
Let me say I don't really know Wes Streeting. We were going to meet, but we never did for various reasons. We made appointments to meet, and then he had a whip at one time and a vote, and that disintegrated. And it's not always easy to keep those appointments, and I don't think he needs to apologise for that in any kind of way. So I've not talked with him in detail, but I think that I've no doubt that he's an able, bright individual who I think is quite sensitive. And I think the sensitivity has been shown actually in how he's handled this. I think he's absolutely right to be looking at all sorts of options. And I think there are options could easily be taken which would in fact avoid this strike. Why the doctors don't seem to want to consider it, I don't understand. That seems a very political issue. It's almost as if they did want to challenge the government in a way and change it. And I think that's a dangerous thing to do. I don't think any group should really do that to a government. It's happened before, of course, in British politics. It happened certainly in the 70s and 80s. But I think it's a very dangerous, not with medicine, with other employees. And I think it's a dangerous thing to be doing, especially where, in fact, you need to have regard. The most respected profession, if you look at all the polls until very recently, was the medical profession. Being a doctor was regarded as being more respectable than being a teacher or a nurse, or in a bank or whatever it might be. And I fear that that is an important part of treatment, because actually, if people trust you and they feel they're getting good medicine, they tend to get better because of what we call a placebo effect, which actually is not insignificant. It's been shown again and again that attitude to your medicine plays a major role in actually how you heal. And if you are reasonably happy and reasonably sure of your treatment, what studies have shown is that actually your symptoms get less and your treatment tends to be quicker.
And will that trust be damaged by these strikes, do you think?
It's a great question. I fear it has been. Judging from the number of letters I've had. I've only had one letter, one email from the wife of a resident doctor who said that she couldn't afford a mortgage. And, I understand that. But then, of course, when I was a resident doctor, I couldn't afford a mortgage. I didn't get my first house until 10 years after I qualified. I mean, it is a problem. And I think, but in the long term, it's a pretty secure job, and you can do a lot of things with it, and you can earn in all sorts of ways if you want to.
With a very good pension as well.
I mean, for example, now doctors get overtime, and that was something which was introduced a long time after I was trained, a long time after I'd become a senior.
Yes.
Almost for retirement then, actually.
And you said you had one email from somebody saying they couldn't afford a mortgage. Does that mean that all of the other emails you've had have been against the strikes?
Yeah, I haven't had volumes of emails, but I've had a number of people I've had quite a number of emails that have said, thank you for speaking out. This is really important. And these are people who are not in the main medics. Some are, but some are medics. Some are senior medics of considerable respect. I mean, people who I am a bit frightened of, actually, because I feel they are so respectable. But but also ordinary doctors who I don't know, and actually many people, of course, who come from all sorts of walks of life. A few musicians, for example. I mean, It's interesting. It's quite a wide area.
So if you're getting messages from other doctors, are other doctors perhaps too frightened to stand up to either their colleagues or the BMA?
Well, I think that's an interesting question. It's an important question to ask, because actually, if that is true, and I think it could be true, then we need to do something about it. We need to explain that actually a herd mentality isn't a great idea, that one needs to be really thinking individually to some extent and not be frightened of being a blackleg or whatever it might be because you don't actually feel that you shouldn't work. I think when it comes to moral responsibilities, we have each of us to decide what is our moral view. And there have been times in my own treatment leading a large team. For example, when my team was really big, I remember having a colossal argument with my whole team because there was one patient I wanted to treat and none of the team thought I should because they thought it would be in fact a bad treatment. I won't go into details, but it involved HIV at the time. And I thought that this patient deserved the treatment. But it took me 6 months to persuade my team. But eventually, they saw the moral value of actually offering treatment to somebody who was clearly in need of treatment. And I feel, that actually occasionally each of us, I've seen this with so many colleagues, will stood up with things that I hadn't really thought about. And, I think one has to do that to some extent. You are an individual within that service, they're part of the team.
Yeah. One of the things that you have spoken about recently is the way that the BMA has handled anti-Semitism within hospitals. Do you think it's allowed some of its members to sort of cross a line from just expressing political opinions into endorsing some form of hatred or singling out their Jewish colleagues?
So it seems, and I've had a number of letters from colleagues who have raised that issue with me. I suppose, when you're dealing with an issue, in this case, the doctor's strike, you don't want to muddle your other issues in with it. But I think there are lots of areas where the BMA is failing. One, of course, is clearly ethics, which is quite important. Secondly, I think people like myself, clinical academics, who do some clinical work, but also, of course, run their work in parallel with their research, have very, very poor responses from the BMA. We don't feel we're at all well represented. Clinical academics are often, I exclude myself, but many of them are the leaders in medicine in this country. And if the NHS is going to improve, the clinical academics are going to be the people who are going to do it, because they look at the scientific basis for the medicine and how that could be improved. Anti-Semitism certainly is something that I know that a lot of Jews have been worried about, and certainly sometimes I've seen some what I thought pretty horrific things that are still going on and not properly dealt with. So yeah, I think if you're asking this question, I think it's fair to say, although my resignation was absolutely to do with the strike, I think there are a number of issues that made me feel that really, well, actually, it's not really an organisation which is representing me, even though I'm paying it a fee. Why should I belong any longer? I never used to feel like that before.
No.
The main journal, the British Medical Journal, is a high-impact journal, but of course, one can get that online for free. I don't need to get it for money.
And you said that you've seen some things that have worried you in terms of anti-Semitism in the workplace. Can you give us a bit more detail on that?
To some extent, one of the issues, undoubtedly, which people have repeatedly complained about, is the idea that being Jewish means that you're an Israeli, that you're responsible for the Israel government, for example, and the appalling things which are happening in the Middle East. And of course, I'm not going to try to defend what's happening in the Middle East. I think it's a disaster for everybody, and the sooner that is dealt with by negotiation, as of course all these conflicts need to be, then the better. But of course, I've seen many people who've been, who clearly have felt very, very unpleasantly criticized for actually something which is of no fault of theirs, simply because they're Jewish.
So in summary then, as far as the BMA is concerned, is the BMA still fit for purpose or not?
It'll be interesting to ask them that, but if they don't answer letters after I've asked my letter to be forwarded, argues that that's not fit for any purpose, because actually, surely, if somebody who's been in the organisation for a fairly long time, who's reasonably senior, who's got some chance of making something helpful, some comments helpful actually in a political arena, then you'd have thought that they would take the trouble to jot me a line or send me an email.
Yeah,
it's not as if they couldn't find it.
Professor Winston, you've been very generous with your time. Thank you so much for coming on the Daily Tea.
Lord Winston there massively reminds me of my dad, who is a retired GP, worked for 4 decades in the NHS and in geriatric care. And I had a kind of interesting insight into what you would describe as a sort of boomer doctor thinks of the current state of our profession, medical profession, and also the current state of hospital care, because we had to be in and out of hospital most of last year caring for my stepmother, Bernice, my dad's second wife, who is married to for 33 years, who passed away in November. So you're seeing it through your own eyes, but I was also seeing it through my father's eyes, having worked through the ranks from medical school, junior house officer, etc., to get to where he ended up in his career. Very well-respected family doctor. Still get messages from readers saying, "Are you Dr. Tomini's daughter? He looked after me in Harpenden. He was brilliant, blah, blah, blah." The sort of standard that my dad expects of the NHS, I think, is there in parts, but not comprehensively. He obviously was involved in giving cradle-to-grave care. He was making quite a lot of demands of the medical staff looking after my stepmother that they weren't really able to meet. A lot of them weren't well trained. A lot of them didn't speak perfect English, and I'm including the doctors as well as the nurses in this. And my dad was sort of tearing his hair out saying, well, this is not how I would have done it, and where's the doctor on the ward round, and there should be a qualified professional here, even though it's midnight, and when I was trained, I did this and that. Now, I don't know what modern day medics would think of my father's approach. Probably think that times are very different there. We had a smaller population. We had far less immigration. We had different technological advances now. You know, the technological advances they still have to fill out reams and reams of paperwork, which seemed counterintuitive. But the bottom line is this. He would concur with Winston in saying that he thinks it's totally opposed to the Hippocratic Oath to do patients active harm by not being at work, by being on strike. And that might seem old school and traditional, but he, like the IVF specialist, believes that the BMA has become far too politicised, that it's now become a sort of pseudo-socialist left-wing organisation that isn't really for patients. It's prioritising doctors' needs ahead of those that they're meant to be looking after.
Would your father have regarded being a doctor as a vocation
Yes.
or a profession?
A vocation.
It's a vocation.
Because don't forget, they were paid peanuts.
Exactly.
I think
But
my
that's the thing.
my dad's
You see-
highest wage while he was a doctor was something like 31 grand, and he was at the absolute top of his profession when he ran his own surgery in a leafy Hertfordshire town.
You see, I think a lot of conservatives say the BMA, etc., has become politicised, and they label it as left-wing. But if you think about what the demand actually is here, it's really materialistic, and some might even say selfish. These are people who, at this stage in their career, might be paid peanuts, I get it, but why can't they get their heads around the fact that their salary then dramatically goes up, and that they benefit from salary-linked pensions? So GPs can get as much as a salary over £100,000 by the end of their career. The median pension, according to government figures, of a GP in 2023 to 2024 was £53,300. So you have doctors saying, we're paid poorly right now, ignoring they're going to be paid a lot more in the future, and they're going to enjoy a job security and a pension security that you and I couldn't dream of. They then raise threats like, if I'm not paid enough, I'll go abroad.
Yes, well, go
Now
abroad then.
that to me is not a socialist ethic. I don't see anything about socialism in that. To say, I'm not paid enough and also the weather's bad, so I'm going to take all the education and instruction that I've received in this country from
paid for by the state and their
by
own
the community
tuition
that has
fees.
financed me and supported me, and I'm going to go somewhere where it's warmer and fewer hours and better pay. So I love the NHS, and because of how run down the NHS is, I'm going to leave the NHS and go and work for a mixed system elsewhere. So that doesn't make sense either. So I come back to, is this really about being political, or is this just a trade union that's
Yes.
just demanding more money for its
Well,
people?
that's what it is.
And will go on demanding it. But because it's doctors and it's the NHS, and because your father's generation gave to the NHS this impression of it is almost a volunteer service, it's a care service, regardless of what the pay is or the hours are, we would do this anyway.
But don't forget
I think a
also-
younger generation has entered it who do not have that altruistic attitude.
Yes.
And is so typical of woke. They give the impression, because they say the right things about race or gender, that they care. I don't think there's much to do with care in this. I think it's to do with I want more money in my bank account.
And you're learning that despite the record amounts of investment in the NHS, it is still nearly 30% less productive than it was 20 years ago. And then you're being told, but for less productivity and longer waits, we're going to pay junior doctors more.
Right, yeah.
Most people say, I'm not sure if that makes any sense or if it's even fair. It was the same with the rail workers, right?
Yeah.
Okay, trains are cancelled left, right and centre. You can barely get a seat. Tickets are skyrocketed, but let's pay rail workers more because the unions say so, even though Labour has come in and spent 14 years mocking the Tories for their inability to negotiate with the unions.
Yeah.
Now we've got, as far as I can tell, we're paying them more and they're still striking.
Yeah.
That's not a great deal for the UK, is it? For the UK taxpayer.
No, and I think politically things are moving on. There has always been, the NHS is the closest thing the Brits have to a religion. Post-COVID, there was a great deal of sympathy for the NHS because they worked very hard on that and took great personal risk, and there was a feeling that more money had to go in and we should pay professionals more cash. But now I feel we're coming to the end of that period. now that we're entering a period of austerity in government finances, in which there are going to be cuts for everyone, the image of public sector workers demanding and getting pay increases in double figures is really going to grate with the public. And the interesting question is, does that then translate into a wider call for reform? Do the public just turn against unions, or do they start saying, maybe actually the NHS does need serious reform?